what a joy it is to be with you all, with you who are in this space and with all those online in various countries. What an amazing conference this is in terms of its reach. It's an important one. The theme of sowing seeds, legacy. And given the quality of the speakers, I'm already learning much today, and I've got more to learn later this day, that is for sure. I speak as a grandparent with 4 grandchildren and 3 step-grandchildren, a blended bunch of grandchildren, if you like, and I'm sure many people in here can identify with a blended grandchildren group. But let me begin with Old Nan. You've got notes there in that booklet, and you can follow what I'm going to say in that particular outline. So Old Nan brings me to some autobiography. I'm an only child. I was born in Sydney, but around the age of 7, the family broke up. It was a case of domestic violence and cheating, and my mother never remarried. In fact, it was such a traumatic event in the life of the family that she was hospitalised for 3 months in a psychiatric facility. And my paternal grandmother came all the way from Waverley by public transport to Kirribilli, and for 3 months, Old Nan looked after me. And she represented the rock. Ian used the image from the Bible of anchor. I could have said anchor, but I used rock. She was the rock in my growing up. And she was that stable person right to the end, decades later when she passed away at 95 years of age. And there are enough studies around, friends, to show that growing up, a child needs at least one adult, just one, who is that rock in their growing up. Could be a parent, of course, but it could be an uncle, could be an aunt, could be a grandparent. For me, that rock was Old Nan. And I wonder if you can reflect on your own experience, life experience, and is there someone like that you can identify in your own growing up? And it seems to me we need, as grandparents, to be rocks, like Old Nan was for me. And to do so in what I call an age of vertigo. Now, what's vertigo? I really didn't know what vertigo was until a few years ago. I was to speak at Moore College. I was to give a sermon in chapel, and I was to give a lecture that night. And during the night before, I woke up and time to go to the bathroom, which happens when you reach a certain age. And the room began to spin. I found myself bouncing into walls. It was quite a terrifying moment because I actually thought I was having a stroke. Well, it turned out that in our inner ears we have these tiny calcium crystals, and they can get loose. And that creates the condition of vertigo. So the next 24 hours was quite a challenge, but a great relief to find out from a doctor that it was this particular issue of vertigo, when everything seems to spin. And it seems to me we live in an age like that makes our heads spin. The Polish sociologist Zygmunt Bauman, with a name like that, you know he must be important, had another way of putting it. He says, we live in an age of liquid modernity. Nothing is stable now. Institutions, values, relationships, traditions, everything seems to be flowing and in flux. Well, according to the latest census, now Christians are a minority in Australia. They weren't when I was a boy. So my question is, what kind of grandparent do we aspire to be in an age of vertigo? When there's so much social change, how can we be the grandparent who sows seeds of faith, hope, and love. How? By being illuminators, not diminishers. That's a distinction I get from that American journalist and cultural analyst by the name of David Brooks. In a recent book, How to Know a Person, The Art of Seeing Others Deeply and Being Deeply Seen, illuminators, he says, shine the brightness of their care on people and make them feel bigger, deeper, respected, and lit up, while diminishers see people as objects to be used, not as persons to know and care for. I found that to be a very wise insight. And I found myself joining it up to another insight I got from the Australian social scientist Hugh Mackay in his book, What Makes Us Tick, making sense of who we are and the desires that drive us. The number one, he says, is being taken seriously. Being taken seriously. Seems to me illuminators take people seriously. Illuminators take their grandchildren seriously. Old Nan was an illuminator for me, not a diminisher. She took me seriously, so I felt valued and cared for, had worth. So how can we be illuminators? Let me suggest by sowing seeds of faith, hope, and love through modelling. And as you notice, I don't have slides as such, so my talks are powerless and pointless. It seems to me that we can be usefully described as the body language of the invisible God. The Apostle Paul wrote to the Corinthian Christians in his second letter, in chapter 7, that when he came into Macedonia, he had no rest, but was harassed at every turn, conflicts on the outside and fears within. That's so refreshingly honest, especially if you're a pastor. But God, he says, who comforts the downcast, comforted us by the coming of Titus, an associate in ministry. No burning bush, no voice from heaven, but God at work nonetheless. Titus was, in effect, the body language of the invisible God. He brought comfort, he embodied presence, an idea I'll come back to. Well, that was way back then. What about now? Well, Celtic Christians talk about thin places where God seems to be so obviously God. But a few years back, well, a number of years back now, my wife and I found ourselves in a thick place. Jules was sick for a couple of years. I won't go into the details, but life was thick with fog. And more than once I asked the question, does God really care? But over time I came to realize that God did care. He did so through the coming of Titus into our lives, as it were. I mean the people who sat with Jules while I was lecturing at Moore College. I think of the people who cooked meals for us. One of them, Archie Poulos, who is here today. I've never forgotten the dish that Archie cooked. And he happens to be speaking to us later today. Practical, loving care. We can be models of that loving care. Hopefully seen in the way we love our spouses, love our adult children, and love our grandchildren. Models of keeping faith, People who make promises to their grandkids and actually keep them. We say we're going to take them to a movie, to the movie we take them. And models of hope in an age of vertigo, because it's a world, it seems to me, of despairing young people. You're being told at the age of 15 or 25, 35, from the Secretary General of the UN, that we're in the era of global boiling. And it's arrived. Boiling seas with climate change. Now, what the merits of that is another question. But the fact of the matter is, how would you feel at 15 to hear that? There's a mental health crisis amongst our young people, as Susie Lee pointed out. Exposing our grandkids to grandparents full of faith, full of hope, full of love. Let me think especially about love. It's the renowned psychotherapist Erich Fromm said there are two kinds of people in the world. And I don't mean by that those who are mourning people and those who hate mourning people. I don't mean that. I mean those who care, he says, and those who don't. But how do we show our loving care? Susie Lee was so right earlier today in her session. Listening is so important, whatever the age of our grandkid. Nothing shows that you take someone seriously, that you really care about them, like listening so well that they feel understood. And friends, let's especially avoid being toppers, especially if you are a storyteller, someone who likes the old anecdote 2, 3, or 1,000. That's the person who, as soon as he or she hears something the other person says, they've got a story. And in comes the topper. Let me illustrate. Your grandson says how hard it was to lose at basketball last weekend. And so what do you say? Well, you think that was a bad loss. When I was a boy, we lost twice as badly as that, and I got over it, and so will you. Instead, we could have asked, how did it make you feel? Did you feel that you let the team down? Questions can show that we are really listening. Statements can show that we've not listened at all. What did James say in his first chapter, full of wisdom? Be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to get angry. Showing loving care how? By encouraging them in their interests. And how do we know those interests? By observation, by asking questions of our grandkids and their parents. Otherwise, you'll turn up, say, with a toy that was 1 year ago, that was relevant. My wife, as you heard, Jules, is a fashion designer. Our granddaughter loves fashion. Jules teaches her sewing lessons. That's an interest. I have a grandson who's interested in World War II. He lives in Canberra, so when he came to Melbourne, I took him to see the HMAS Castlemaine. It's a corvette, a very small warship, beautifully restored. It's moored in a nearby suburb of Williamstown. It's a floating museum. We had a ball. Up to the bridge, down to the engine room. Up to the bridge, down to the engine room. Back to the stern, then to the bow. From the bow to the stern. It was amazing. I was surprised at how much excitement he got out of it. And, friends, Castlemaine, not Castlemaine. I'm originally from Sydney, from Bondi. I'm retired in Melbourne, so I've had to become bilingual. Showing loving care. How? By participating in their interests. Knowing their interests, asking questions about their interests, participating in it. My young grandson, this is some years ago, Thomas the Tank Engine. We watched it over and over and over again. I heard Ringo Starr's voice so often I thought he was living with us. And with a range of ages in our grandchildren, their interests are so different. Lego for the 9-year-old, fitness for the 22-year-old. Knowing their interests. And showing how loving care by treats. The walk to the ice cream shop or the car ride. Really nice ice cream. With 2 of my grandkids, that means anything but mint. Or like old Nan, when I went to stay as a boy at her place, she would cook me breakfast in bed. Bacon on toast. I love bacon, and the smell of bacon to this very day. Ross Campbell, in his excellent book, How to Really Love Your Grandchild in an Ever-Changing World, How to Really Love Your Grandchild. He's written a lot of books that have been helpful to us right from the days of our being parents of little children. A book like How to Really Love Your Child, and then it became How to Really Love Your Adult Child, and now it's How to Really Love Your Grandchild. He talks about grandparents needing to be sources of wisdom, comforting presences, and providing a loving, understanding ear. Friends, we can be the body language of the invisible God in the lives of our grandchildren. Sowers of seeds of hope, faith, and love, and sowing seeds of faith, hope, and love through praying. I like what William Temple, he was the Archbishop of Canterbury during some of the war years, said about prayer, and I suspect he had a twinkle in his eye. When I pray, coincidences happen. When I don't, they don't. But that's been my experience over decades. But what do we pray for? Pray for opportunities to show care, to show interest, a meal out, a movie, a concert, a sporting event, or playing a video game with them. Ian talked about humility. Well, you play Mortal Kombat with a 15-year-old. Their fingers move so fast. It's just wrong. A grandson who lives in another state, we have a yearly visit, sometimes it's going to be 3 times this year. What happens? Lunch at a Mexican restaurant, and then a movie. Despicable Me 4. That's what it was earlier this year. Seizing opportunities as the day affords them. Last week, my son in Melbourne asked if I'd go to an aircraft museum with my grandson and with him after church. My grandson had asked, "Could Granddaddy come?" Now, I must say something about that. I've got 3 names. Granddaddy with that family, Papa Gray with another family, and Papu with the Greek family. So you've got to get all the names right. So what did I say? Absolutely. And so off to Moorabbin Air Museum we went. He climbed into this plane, into that plane. He tried the flight simulator. He loved it. And at the gift shop, I bought him a model of a Spitfire, his favourite plane of the day. And that's something I hope will become a memento that he never forgets. And here, I think, is such an important point. Pray for the right people to come into their lives. Pray for the right people to come into their lives as friends, as teachers. If they're in a team, people involved in the team, the coach, pray for the right people, because the wrong company can make a disastrous difference. And pray perseveringly. Jules' maternal grandmother, or paternal grandmother actually, had 5 sons. She prayed for them, prayed for them, prayed for them. None of them were believers when she died. All 5 came to faith. Pray perseveringly. And then sowing seeds of faith, hope and love from a distance. For 20 years we lived in the US, mainly in Chicago, but with a 4-year stint in Alabama, y'all. Now, Chicago is known as the Windy City. That was coined in the late 19th century, not to describe the weather, but the politicians. I think many of us live in windy cities. We've been back in Australia 3 years now. But in those years, Chicago is 15,500 kilometres from Melbourne. So for Jules and me, the challenge was how to be illuminators at such a distance. And some of you are facing these challenges. Which brings me to the 3 powers that Ross Campbell writes about in that book. The first is the power of FaceTime, or it could be Skype. The power of FaceTime or Skype. Technology can not only create distance. Think of a teenager who cannot get off the smartphone even at the dinner table. But happily, technology can abolish distance. We use FaceTime in Chicago to play Peppa Pig through the screen with grandchildren. They had Peppa Pig action figures. We had Peppa Pig action figures. Today it'd be Bluey. Second, the power of the package. Remembering those birthdays, sending those gifts, knowing their interests and addressing them. Socks, yes, but also that manga comic. Knowing their interests as well as their needs. And third, the power of presence, the power of presence. Visits abolish distance. Technology is great, but it can't replace the physical presence. So we'd bring the same action toys on our annual visit. So Peppa Pig was in the suitcase. And trying to create memorable moments in those visits. One of them happened with Jules and our grandson going to church. It was a communion service, and the minister was up there getting the bread and the wine all ready. And the grandson asked, "Are we going to have morning tea?" He was eager for a bite of the communion bread. And here it was me, thinking that it was the English who invented morning tea, but it was Jesus. The power of FaceTime, the power of the package, the power of the presence. Powers, at least 2 of them, that can help abolish distance. So I'm so glad there's going to be a whole session on grandparenting at a distance later today, because we still have a grandchild in Canberra while we live in Melbourne. It remains a challenge for us. And for those online, I'd imagine some of you have grandchildren in other countries even, or in other states, if it's the US, for example. Well, let me sum it up. Friends, let's be illuminators in the lives of our grandchildren as we have opportunity, not diminishes. Let's be a rock in an age of vertigo, like old Nan was to me. Solid, consistent, reliable, stable, promise keepers. Let's be grandparents who sow seeds of faith, hope and love through embodying those things, modelling those things, and through prayer. So let me ask the question. Let's think about what kind of grandparent our grandkids meet in you and in me. Do they meet an illuminator? Or do they meet a diminisher? Do they meet someone who takes them seriously? Do they meet someone who really listens so that they feel they've been understood? Do they meet someone poised in an age of vertigo because we are hopeful, because we can trust Jesus, the Lord of time and space? Someone that the Apostle Paul wrote about as, in Romans 12:12, someone who is joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. For Jules and myself, that's become our verse as we've entered the fourth quarter of our lives, before the final whistle blows. Joyful in hope, living like people who know that this isn't the only world there is, and yet we truly care about this one. So we actually recycle. Patient in affliction. Look, our bodies don't work like they used to. At least mine doesn't. Vertigo shows me that. I recall attending a birthday party earlier this year, and all of us were in our senior years. And when we came in, one of them turned to me and said, "Welcome to the organ recital." Happily, the event was celebratory and didn't turn medical. And showing how to suffer Christianly. Ross Campbell's book ends with a chapter written by a granddaughter, Cami Ross. And she writes about her grandma Campbell in these terms. "I want to mention one final thing. My grandmother fought cancer with grace and strength, spiritual strength. In so doing, she taught me a lesson I will never forget. I saw her calm assurance that the Lord was caring for her. And I knew that if I can someday possess a faith that is anywhere near as powerful as hers, I will have succeeded in life." Makes me wonder what my grandchildren might write about me. Joyful in hope, patient in affliction, and then faithful in prayer. Remember Archbishop William Temple's words, "When I pray, coincidences happen, and when I don't, they don't." For example, our grandkids face a particular challenge with that exam looming. We just send a brief text praying for you. Not preaching at them, but praying for them. The other day, my wife Jules asked our granddaughter how school was going. And she said it was difficult. So Jules said, "I'll pray for you. In fact, we pray for you every day." And Jules tells me the look of astonishment on her face. Take the opportunity. Praying for them, not preaching at them. I doubt whether she'll ever forget that moment. Friends, may God give us the grace to be the kind of grandparent who is joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer, seed sowers. Amen.